Okay,
Okay, Marianne.
recording started. All right. Let me go ahead. Dan Bernal. Ann Boynton.
Here.
James DeBenedetti.
Here.
Dana Dornsife.
Here.
Dana Goldman. Ted Goldstein.
Here.
David Higgins.
Here.
Harlan Levine.
Here.
Pat Levitt.
Here.
Adriana Padilla.
Here.
Amar Kadan. Al Roulette.
Here.
Maheswari Senthil. David Serrano Sewell. Adrian Shapiro. Jonathan Thomas.
Here.
Art Torres.
Here.
Okay.
How far short are we?
We are short by 1.
Okay. This promises to be a very productive meeting, members, and it's going to be basically an overview of where we've been and where we're headed, and also a review of our first and last, not last, but our first field meeting, which took place in the Central Valley. So I'd like to ask Sean to open it up.
All right, thank you, Senator. Yeah, let me start showing my slides and we'll kick this off. All right, are we good with slides? Anybody give me a thumbs up? Excellent, thank you. All right, well, welcome everybody to December 1st, our AAWG meeting. This is the last AAWG meeting of the year. We are now exactly 9 months to this day into this journey. We've created quite a bit of successes with respect to some of the work streams that we put in play. I do want to thank a couple people right out of the gate. One is Maria Milan for having the vision of medical affairs. I think 2 to 3 years from now, we're going to realize that she is a visionary when it comes to the type of infrastructure that's going to be needed to support many of the clinical trials that are going to soon, hopefully, read out, and that will roll into commercial approval, hopefully, for a couple of them. Also, Senator Torres, who has provided significant leadership right out of the gate on day 1 to us. Without him, he has interacted with a number of colleagues at the state level that have gotten medical affairs exposed to all the way to the governor's office. And I think some of those colleagues will be instrumental as we develop access and affordability moving forward. So for today, we have 4 items we want to address. One is we want to provide an update on the patient support program and the RFP. 2, Scott Tosher from legal, many of you probably worked with him in the past, is going to provide a verbal update on our COI. Now, this is important because as we start to roll into 2023, we have a lot of activities. It's going to be really heavy. I'm looking forward to some of the activities that we get to kick off in January. But in order to do that, we do have to take a look at conflicts of interest. And so Scott will provide an update and the rationale why we're kicking that off. Then I'm going to kick it over to our esteemed colleague, Jeff Lomax in Medical Affairs. As you know, we've had our first Community Care Centers of Excellence listening session. So he's going to provide a robust update from the UCSF Fresno meeting. And then it's going to punt back to me and we'll finish up with a quick introduction with the kickoff of our roadmap for access and affordability. So for me, give you an update on the patient support program. So we have our final RFP that's circulating right now for review. It's the final review process. We've received a lot of great insight and comments from our CIRM colleagues. We have one more process of reviews. Our anticipation is that we'll be able to post this by the end of the year, before the end of the year. And if all goes well, we'll be able to at least flip the switch, if you will, on Q2, Q3, and start helping patients as quickly as possible through the clinical trial process. So with that, I want to punt it over to Scott to give us a quick update on the COI.
Thank you, Sean, and good morning, everyone. As Sean indicated, he asked me to brief the working group on a couple of policies that will apply to your work as it moves from a broad sort of general consideration of programs and into consideration of recommending specific awards or consideration of specific contracts and review of confidential and proprietary information in the course of those reviews or receiving confidential portfolio updates or other types of non-public information. I know that this is not the most exciting topic, so I'll try to get it done quickly. But it is important because, of course, everything that CIRM does is subject to great scrutiny, and historically conflicts of interest and our approach to managing conflicts have drawn particular attention. So by way of background, because this working group and other CIRM working groups are purely advisory bodies, the law that created CIRM and this working group exempts the members of this working group, the non-ICOC members, from the state's conflict of interest laws, among other things. However, the law does require that our governing board, the ICOC, adopt policies governing conflicts of interest to apply to members of this working group. So to that end, the ICOC has adopted COI policies based in part on NIH guidelines that govern a variety of potential sources of conflict of interest to ensure that any funding recommendations are made in a fair manner that is free from conflicts. So pursuant to the bylaws that this working group reviewed and that were adopted by the ICOC this year, the ICOC will be adopting a COI policy, hopefully this month, to fulfill that requirement in the bylaws and the act that this body operate pursuant to a COI policy. And again, these rules will be modeled very closely on rules that the ICOC has already adopted to apply to another of its award recommending bodies, the Grants Working Group. So the rules will be fairly, I think, intuitive in application and will identify confidentially financial interests that would disqualify members from participating in the consideration of a particular application or contract in the event that a member has a conflict. The ICOC generally defines potential conflicts according to three types: financial, personal, and professional. So for instance, if a member of this working group or his or her immediate family member is an employee of an applicant institution or a key person on the application, or is promised income of a certain threshold from the applicant, or if the member is under consideration for employment with the applicant institution or otherwise receives some financial benefit, then a conflict will exist, and then we will preclude the member from participating in the consideration of that award. A professional conflict would be one where the member and an individual on an application are engaged in or are planning to engage in a joint project of some sort. And personal conflict would be present where an immediate family member or close personal friend is listed on the application, or where the member and a person on the application have been on opposing sides in a lawsuit. So as part of the process prior to the meeting of this working group to consider an application, a module will be set up with our grants working group personnel who will help set this up for us. A module will be set up in advance of a meeting that will identify key institutions and key personnel and individuals on an application, and you'll have the opportunity to review that list and identify potential conflicts. I also wanted to address a separate but equally important policy that's pertinent to the working group work when it considers specific applications or reviews non-public confidential information. As part of your bylaws that you reviewed and were recommended by this working group and adopted by the board, members of the working group are governed by a confidentiality policy to ensure the protection of confidential and proprietary information that you receive when doing the work of this group. We maintain the confidentiality during the review process of a particular application to protect the interests of the applicants and to encourage candor among yourselves when you are reviewing the value of an application or contract. And again, pretty straightforward, where confidential information is part of an application, it's our obligation and the members to safeguard it. Therefore, the policy prohibits disclosure of any review materials or contents of the discussions during the review with any outside parties. Similarly, any hard copy materials, for instance, that might be generated during the review must not be shared and must be destroyed after the meeting. So those are just the highlights of a couple of the key policies that will govern the work that Sean described going into 2023. And I just appreciate the opportunity to bring them to your attention.
Thank you very much, Scott. And of course, I know there will be questions down the road, so please feel free to communicate with Scott any questions you might have when issues come up as we go through this process.
Great.
Thank you again. So now we're going to have an update on our first CCCE listening session. I think Dr. Lomax is going to provide us the overview.
Correct. Jeff, it's all yours.
Great. If we can have the next slide. Thank you. And thank you, Senator Torres. And by way of introduction, again, I'm Jeff Lomax. I'm a senior science officer on the medical affairs and policy team. And I've had the pleasure of being able to work with the team to kick off our process for the development of the Community Care Centers of Excellence program. So to give you a sense of the process, and again, reminder, the end game here is to come up with what we'd call a request for application. So coming up with a document that would allow organizations to come in and apply for funding to this program. And this is a fairly standard procedure at CIRM, and I've applied it to the Community Care Centers of Excellence program. And so we're at the beginning of the process, which I've described as the needs assessment phase, where we're planning on a series of regional listening sessions that includes providers, individuals involved in workforce development, and also community members, and with the aim of really understanding both the needs and capacities of providers, the workforce, and the community. In the needs assessment phase, we include members of the ICOC, specifically the patient advocates. We have a limited number that can attend because these are small group sessions, and we're being respectful of the limits on the number of members that can be involved in a meeting. And we're aiming to hold a series of sessions through the end of January, perhaps early February. I'm going to update you on a meeting that occurred in the Fresno area. We're also looking, we've just had confirmation that we'll be having a session in Riverside in late January. And we're also looking towards the Redding area to cover Northern California. And we may include additional sites. After the needs assessment phase, we're planning on a workshop where we try to bring together the broader group of stakeholders, and also we'll be able to have a public, excuse me, be able to have a public workshop where we can have participation with ICOC members without limitation on the numbers. Finally, from this workshop, we're aiming to come up with a draft concept plan, which we will be working with this working group and the science subcommittee of the ICOC to present a draft, which will then be going to the ICOC for final approval in June. Excuse me for 1 minute. Sorry. Can I have the next slide, please? So what I'd like to do now is cover an update on the listening sessions themselves, how we've organized them, and give you some highlights from our first session. Before I do this, I'd also like to recognize the contributions of two other critical team members, Emily Reyes and Maribel de la Torre, who are program managers on our team, and they've really done a tremendous lift here in terms of pulling the meetings together and making sure everything runs smoothly. So the regional meetings are intended to do three things in terms of information gathering. One is to understand the capacities of regional providers to support clinical research. The second is to identify workforce training needs to support patients in regenerative medicine. And the third is to identify opportunities to partner with community-based organizations to bring patient groups into clinical research and really work at the community level, really with the aim of trust building, which is a theme that's come up within these sessions. So let me go to the next slide, which summarizes some of what we're calling our takeaways. And again, I want to be a little bit careful here. What I want to present to you in this slide is how we're sort of organizing our thinking and giving you some preliminary thoughts, but I want to sort of context that with the fact that this is our first meeting. So sometimes slides can take on a little bit of a larger than life sort of persona. And so this is very preliminary, but it's really, again, how we're trying to array the information and give you some thinking and get feedback from you all in terms of, are we on the right track in terms of both how we're organizing our thinking and presenting some of the results. So one thing we learned very much from the Fresno experience was there is a very comprehensive infrastructure already to support clinical research in terms of clinical networks, the technology, the clinical footprint. In addition, they are eager to collaborate with our Alpha Clinics network, and there's a number of potential opportunities and collaborations that were identified in that discussion. We had Alpha Clinic teams participate in this discussion with folks from Clovis, Fresno. And I'm showing you this arrow here. The main takeaway was not that, it was interesting, it wasn't that they felt they needed the infrastructure. What it was really the know-how and the training and the ability to sort of network with our existing clinical sites to develop the ability to support clinical trials locally in the Fresno Clovis area. So again, sort of making that connection, if you see that arrow connecting clinical readiness to training, that was what we'd call a very strong theme that emerged from this discussion. In addition, looking at if you move over to the side of the increasing patient access, there was a very robust discussion that involved local physicians that both were affiliated with a medical center, but also primary care physicians from the community. And the theme that emerged there was that, again, sort of connecting physician capacity and knowledge to this sort of what we're calling training and education, is that the physicians locally felt that there was still very limited knowledge about regenerative medicine, cell and gene therapy. The types of programs we're supporting really are not visible and not part of the conversation, particularly with local doctors or primary care physicians. And the suggestion there was that there really needs to be engagement with groups like the California Medical Association, the Primary Care Association, that brings visibility to the types of programs we're supporting and what the opportunities would be to then have local physicians refer patients to hopefully local sites, which would then be able to connect the patients with either the clinical trials or, you know, the therapies in the future. So I want to pause there. I could, you know, touch on a few other of these points, but you have the slides. To the extent any of these points pique your interest, we'd be happy to elaborate on them. And also ask Sean if he had I know, Sean, you might have some comments in terms of how the patient assistance program fits in here. So if you want to chime in, please do so.
JT has his hand raised.
So thank you, Jeff. And I want to also congratulate Jeff for running a great meeting there at the Fresno Clovis site. Dr. Padilla and I represented the board at that meeting. Maria Bonneville was there as well as Sean and the medical affairs team. It was a highly enthusiastic meeting. I'd say, what, Jeff, we had 20 to 25 people there, something like that.
I think if you include the online participation, it was almost 30 folks in total.
Yes, and what was very evident is heretofore, anybody in the Central Valley hoping to participate in a clinical trial had few options, and frequently, if they could afford it or means were provided, they would get sent to UCSF or UC Davis or whatever. And obviously, there are a number of people that couldn't do that would wish to be involved. And so there was a tremendous need articulated for the community care center of excellence in that area. And I think that the folks in attendance were uniformly highly supportive of this. And the discussion went on for quite some time with Jeff as moderator. And so I think that if this was any indication down the road when it comes time to actually go out with the RFP for this, we're going to see extremely enthusiastic response and a true emphasis on need for exactly this sort of facility, and to be able to connect this to the Alpha Clinic network will greatly enhance the network and will really materially advance the AAWG's goal of accessibility to all throughout the state. So I think you're going to find that this is going to be a very, very successful program.
Mr. Levine.
Sir, thank you. I had maybe just a few foundational questions, and maybe I missed it. So could you comment on the type of physicians or the practices that were represented that showed up to the meeting, number one? Number two, well, actually, let me step back, Jeff, and say thank you for the summary. It was really helpful to hear the discussion. But just, you know, who were the doctors that showed up, number one? Number two, was this really about referring patients, or was there also an interest in actively participating in some of the trials in their offices? And then number three, did any of those kind of old school issues of, you know, losing patients come up in any hint of that come up in any part of the discussion?
Thank you for those questions, and they're all great questions. So first of all, the types of practices, it was primarily, I believe, 3 docs who were affiliated with the medical center were present. and they were describing activities, the ability to interact with existing patient populations in the region. So the primary areas that they were engaged with patients or treating patients, there is a sickle cell program. There's a sickle cell center affiliated in the mix there, and we had one of the docs associated with that center. There's oncology, which was represented, and the third, I'm just blanking on the third. So, but they did have affiliations with the Clovis Fresno Center, and then we had an outside physician who was a primary care physician in the community. So in terms of doctors, I think that rounds out the group in terms of participation. I may be missing someone, but that's it. But it was primarily folks who were affiliated, that would be working with patients. And that, I think, just to jump to your third question around their point, they spent a lot of time discussing this issue of losing patients. And the takeaway that they provided us was they thought the value of having the capacity, even if the patients needed to be treated, say, at a specialty site, say within a gene therapy, the ability to do even pre-treatment, so that the eligibility screening, to do all that work in the community, treat, say, at a remote site, and then come back and do the follow-up in the community, and keeping that patient in the community was among the most important things we could do to avoid patient loss. That was, I think, a strong message. And can you remind me of the second question?
You answered it, actually, which is that they want to participate, but really they understand it would be at the pre-treatment or the assessment, and then the follow-up. And I think that's like probably the most important takeaway is that we have to really structure this in a way that the referring physicians feel like they're part of the process, and that the patients remain with them, even though we recognize that the intricacies or the specifics of the trial will need to get done at an alpha site.
That's correct.
For now, at least.
Potentially, and I'm looking at the hands that are raised. I think we have additional comments to sort of add to my response. So I'll ask my colleagues to please.
Let's go to Adriana.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to reiterate what Jeff said. There was a variety of participants. There was a lot more from the cancer center there in Clovis, and the issue about patients leaving the area. The whole point of the discussion was, they want to have more collaboration with large centers, the alpha centers, the tertiary care institutions, to really bring that back to the Valley. And so that close connection, the ability to do a lot of pre-work in the Valley, to have a central site where there's expertise in coordinating all of these events with patients, was highlighted. So it's not about losing patients. It's about more of developing relationships and the ability to work on infrastructure in the Valley in order to keep the patients locally, which patients struggle with. Nobody really wants to leave if you can have services and the expertise coming in and working all around you. That's the win-win for everybody.
Right. Thank you, Adriana. Maria Milan.
Thank you so much. I echo JT's comments. Extremely productive session. And just to your question, Harlan, some kind of tangible examples of what Dr. Padilla had pointed out is this relationship with academic medical centers and being able to provide access to organ transplant, which is kind of a demonstration case of the types of regenerative medicine treatments in terms of the local referring physicians as well as the treating physicians and the local community being both trained, aware, and connected with the medical centers so that that can happen more readily and provide access. And also, as another example of, as the CAR T field starts to mature, and there are some cases and some applications where it will be more feasible to be able to then potentially generalize this to more centers, that would provide access to others who otherwise may not be able to access the trials and the treatments for cancer indications. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milan. Pat Levitt.
Thanks, Art. I think it was Jeff who mentioned sort of a lack of understanding of CIRM and stem cell initiatives and other things that perhaps we thought were more widely known. And so I think, Jeff, it was you who, as you were reporting, noted that. I think, there's a communications committee, and I sit on that subcommittee, and I think they need to hear this, because I think that we have broader targets for communicating what we do and what the opportunities are than the general public, which is important, and policymakers, which is important. But when you mention that there are physicians and others there who didn't know much about what we are about, I think that's a concern, but also maybe an opportunity for some cross communication between subcommittees to figure out how to deal with that.
That is an excellent point, Pat, and something that I struggled with for the last 13 years at CIRM. How do we get our message out there? Because people are just not understanding who we are yet for the most part. So Maria Gonzalez.
I was just going to echo that. We did hear that at the meeting. And I've heard it subsequently. We had a call with some folks from UC Merced about perhaps applying to different programs that we offer that have nothing to do with the community care centers of excellence, but just in general. So I do think that there's some work we need to do in the Valley and in other harder to reach areas about who we are and what services and what we provide. So that's noted. And Pat, I think it's a great idea to bring this up at the communications subcommittee. I think we're going to schedule one for February. So I think that's great.
Good. And we should continue to move to work more collaboratively with the chancellor at UC Merced, who I know is very interested in our work and is moving forward to create a medical center, a teaching school there in the very near future, which the governor supports. Anybody else on this matter before we move on to our final subject? The roadmap for accessibility and affordability. Sean, I want to thank you, and Maria Milan, and also Maria de la Torre, for all of your efforts and work. Marvel, de la Torre, for all your work and efforts. I've been in contact with the governor's office, and the point person in the governor's office is Richard Figueroa. He was my former staff consultant when I was a member of the Senate Health Committee. And also, they have just appointed the executive director for the Office of Affordability, Vishal, V-I-S-H-A-A-L, Pegani, P-E-G-A-N-Y. And he's taken over already to begin the first steps in setting up the office. So that's the update from my end. And Sean, you have another update.
Yeah, no, that was it. And again, thank you, Senator. So we're already engaged with quite a few individuals at the state level, as I mentioned earlier. And I don't think we would have those contacts without you. So thank you very much for taking the initiative. I expect we'll have pretty good synergies with the governor's office. So it'd be good to get in front of them as soon as possible to present some ideas.
As we call him Fig, Richard Figueroa, is very competent, very astute politically, and so he really gets it. And we've had a couple of conversations about the office, and he was part of the history when we were drafting Prop 14 as well, because I included him in some of our discussions. Any other matters to be brought before this group? If not, I want to thank all of you for participating. I know it takes time out of your very busy schedules, and I hope that the conflict of interest overview by Scott Tosha was helpful. And thank you again, Dr. Lomax, Maria and JT, and Maria Milan, and Maria Bonneville for your participation in Fresno, and also, of course, to Dr. Lomax. So thank you so much and have a wonderful holiday season.
Hold tight, Senator. We still have one last slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Scott. So that was helpful. And we'll continue to talk about COI and the Community Care Centers of Excellence. We are tracking, by the way, according to plan with the CCCE. We anticipate 2 to 3 more meetings, as Jeff mentioned, and then we will likely have concept plan by summer of next year. So now we're going to move on to the roadmap to access and affordability. As you recall, one of CIRM's 5-year strategic plan is to coordinate with the AAWG in developing a roadmap for access and affordability for regenerative medicines for all California patients. This roadmap will include a strategy for gathering the necessary information to support reimbursement, to engage with policymakers and regulators, and develop healthcare delivery models that can be implemented with and refined with the alpha clinics and the future community care centers of excellence. So in January of next year, we will officially kick off the development of a roadmap for access and affordability. We will be focusing primarily, of course, on our CIRM supported trials. About 60% of our efforts will be focusing on access and affordability within those trials, but we also have to think about the 40% as we start to roll potentially into commercialization from some of our trials. And it's important, this goes back to the COI, in order for clinical to present in January, the status of our portfolio, we do need to get those COIs in place. So, and this is critical because how those trials read out will impact the type of roadmap that we want to put in place. So for example, if in fact oncology assets read out first, well, then that's a somewhat of a different playbook than, let's say, the ultra orphan diseases of the world, right? So this goes back to why the COI is critically important. Now, this slide is just an example of a number of strategies that is aligned with the language in Proposition 14. This is just a snapshot to give the AAWG an idea of some of the concepts we'd like to bring to the table for consideration. So let me walk through a couple of these, and then we could talk about our plan, our next 6-month plan for next year. So one of our strategies that we like to present is, of course, facilitating reimbursement and limit patient expenses, right? And this can include, of course, out-of-pocket expenses for patients in the clinical trial setting. Hence, this is where the patient support services sits. And when, in fact, we get this launch, we'll be able to take some of the data that we're getting from our service provider, bring that back to the AAWG, and show the impact that we're having for patients on the financial side. There are a number of additional tactics and strategies we'd like to present under this category. We can include patient navigators, of course, at the Community Care Centers of Excellence. I won't go over all of these, but you can see we've already started thinking about this roadmap for access and affordability. Another area we've already heard from in the community, of course, is the coverage analysis, insurance support, co-pay assistance, and access and appeals, which many of you are familiar with. That is one tactic that we can put in play, again, to help facilitate reimbursement and limit patient expenses. Another strategy is to support new payer models. And there are a number of interesting, and we're on the cusp, quite frankly, of this fascinating, the best way to articulate this is sort of a movement, if you will, with the cell and gene therapies. You've seen quite a few cell therapies that have just been approved. Payers are just getting familiar with some of those value-based contracts. That's true on the public side as well as the private payers. There's an opportunity for us and the AAWG to think about how we might be able to support those models. But even more challenging, perhaps might be able to come up with a model ourselves that we could present to the AAWG and more importantly to the ICOC. So there's a number of strategies that we'll present to the AAWG moving forward. Another one is to address state policy issues. This is and this is something we need to think about. Are we only going to address state California policy issues? Are we going to perhaps recommend new policy issues? Or do we go even further and think about the federal policies? There are a number of things that from a tactic standpoint, we can consider, from treatment across state lines, with many of the clinicians here on the panel understand that clearly. Inpatient versus outpatient reimbursement is another tactic. And then, as Senator Torres mentioned, we're already engaging with the governor's plan on the Office of Health and Affordability. So there can be some great synergies with CIRM and the governor's colleagues. And then finally, to expand on the clinical infrastructure. Now, this is really just piggybacking on what CIRM has already put in play with the robust alpha clinics. There's a great opportunity, of course, to expand and enhance access, of course, to patients out in the rural community with the community care centers of excellence. So that work stream has already kicked off. But here is where we can start kicking in some of the research. So if you think about the patient and post-marketing registries, which are absolutely critical for cell and gene therapies, particularly when you tie it back to the payers, that's something that perhaps we might be able to get engaged with. The other is the real-world evidence and HEOR. So we have an enormous think tank, if you will, across the alpha clinics who can provide guidance. And there's a large repository of data that hopefully we can get access to start addressing some of the strategies and tactics. So these are just 4 strategies that we want to present today. We will start kicking this off in January. What we would like to do, and of course, AAWG will give us guidance on other tactics, other strategies probably that we haven't thought about. Again, this is lined with the language in Proposition 14. What we'd like to do moving forward, starting January, is sort of piecemeal this. So every strategy, we will do the research internally. That's our job with respect to medical affairs. There's a lot that we need to learn. We'll bring in the subject matter experts to give us guidance. And our thinking is that we would bring this information to the AAWG once a month, each strategy, and talk really about a SWOT, if you will. What are the strengths, opportunities? What are the challenges? Where is there an opportunity for us to engage? And can we include that in the roadmap as we move through this whole process? And so if you think about it, we're going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting for the next 6 months. Every month, we will be presenting to the AAWG one of these concepts. And then hopefully at the end, we will have an AAWG approved roadmap that we can present to the ICOC. So, and finally, this is a phenomenally challenging opportunity for CIRM. There are groups that are doing this, obviously in industry, in the private sector, but they are not disclosing it in the public domain. So this is a great opportunity for us, CIRM, to take leadership, right? And perhaps put a model out there that truly would impact patients, right? All the way from the clinical setting to the commercial setting, if in fact some of our assets go to commercialization. So look forward to next year. I want to say thank you. I think I'll stop here and just open it up to questions, Senator.
We have Ms. Hari.
Yes, thank you, Senator Torres. Great presentation. And I think, my question actually links to both the work that has been done, both with the Fresno outreach that we had discussed, as well as this wonderful roadmap that is being presented. And we all completely agree that coordination at the community sites is extraordinarily important, and that is how we are going to make it accessible to our patients. In this process, this is not just unique just for alpha stem cell, the cell and gene therapy. It is true for any clinical trials that we encounter. Some of the issues have revolved around regulatory issues in terms of specific sites being eligible to participate, the needed services that need to be present, PI's expertise, principal investigators' expertise in this local site, and the need for evaluation with central reviews and so on. Have we identified in this partnership and in this roadmap that we have created, what kind of regulatory barriers that we need to overcome to make sure that this would be accessible to our patients at a broad range of community sites?
Well, let me respond. I think that's a significant insight. That is something that we considered early on. I think we do need to do, and this is a great example. That's another potential strategy there. So I think we do need to do some due diligence with the alpha sites and find the true need and ask from the regulatory standpoint, even pre-IND, IND to BLA. So yeah, let us take that on. I think that's good intel.
That's quite a labyrinth as well. Dr. Levitt.
Yeah, so that was a great presentation, and the roadmap is exciting. I don't know how high the barriers are, or how many nails there will be in the road to create flat tires. I just want to make sure that for the first two, in terms of facilitate reimbursement and limit patient expenses and support new payer models, that, and I have to speak up because I am at a children's hospital, that pediatrics is not forgotten. As you all know, children make up 50% of Medicaid patients nationally, as high in California. And California is one of the worst in reimbursement for Medi-Cal for pediatric patients. And so if we're going to provide accessibility and affordability for families who have children who are going to be undergoing care at these clinics, there has to be a recognition that whatever the changes are, whatever the new models are, they just cannot include, that they cannot only include adults, that pediatric populations have to be recognized, because there are two pockets. One is the patient pockets, the other is the hospital pockets that will be in a very difficult position to actually participate in these if the payer mix is not going to cover expenses. So now I'm off my soapbox.
Well, that's very well. It's a great soapbox, and I remember you and I having this conversation. I don't want to forget that I still have been working on it. This is not an easy challenge to undertake. When I was chairman of the Assembly Health Committee back in the 70s, we were talking about these issues. It's always the Medi-Cal reimbursement rate.
Yeah, I just want to mention, maybe some folks saw 3 weeks ago, there was an article in the New York Times about children's hospitals in the Midwest and East closing, and then children's programs within adult hospitals closing. Not like one or two, but like it's right. It's quite serious, because the reimbursement rates in general are not keeping up with what the costs are, and in California it's really a severe problem. So we are funding initiatives and clinical trials that involve children. So right. We want to make sure families have that access.
Well, my son's life was saved at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, as I told you before. So it is a priority for me as well. Dr. Lomax?
Yeah, just to add to that, the previous question about the regulatory support, we'll call it, is that a number of the Alpha Clinic proposals in their original applications actually flagged these as initiatives which they have already begun, actually. So that some of these linkages have already begun between some of the awarded sites and sites that are developing a regenerative medicine platform. And in addition, out of the Fresno meeting, there's been a number of conversations between the Fresno site and UC Davis already. And this ranges from everything from methods for doing coverage analysis out to materials handling, compliance, the whole spectrum. So the good thing to report back at the moment is it's absolutely a critical issue. And fortunately, in these original applications on the alpha side, the teams have already started some of those discussions at sites that are looking to develop further. So I think we're going to see a true network of a knowledge network around these issues, and the ability to both disseminate and support sites as they grow into the field.
Yeah. Senator
Sorry, do
Torres,
you have another comment?
Yes, yeah, I just wanted, Dr. Lomax, thank you so much for that. I speak from a very personal kind of experience on this topic, is because I'm the director of Center for Clinical Research at UCI, and I closely work with our Alpha Stem Cell Clinic, Dr. Daniela Boda, who's the director of Alpha Stem Cell Clinic. One of the key top priorities for UCI is establishing community access and establishing community sites. And this is also part of the Advancing Clinical Trials at Point of Care initiative that is nationally going on. We are also part of it. The main barriers that as we go through this process, as we are doing this at UCI, because we are one of the Alpha Stem Cell Clinic, has been figuring out this regulatory barriers and as to how we can make this an easier process, because it seems like for each protocol, we are trying to overcome some of these regulatory issues. I think as we are moving through this really wonderful roadmap, I think more global solutions to the regulatory barriers that limit access to these clinical studies, not just Alpha Stem Cell Clinic. I think this, if we fix it for Alpha Stem Cell, I think it will apply for other clinical trials, would be necessary to achieve the outcome that we are hoping to achieve. And my proposal would be hopefully have these Alpha Stem Cell clinics that have been funded through CIRM to report back to us in 6 months or whatever time we choose, to talk to us about as to how they have been able to accomplish this, or what are the key barriers that are still limiting us to provide these access to patients in the community sites, so that we can probably have a brainstorming session, figure out as to how we can solve it.
Good idea. Good idea. No further comments from our working group. We have public comments. I believe Kevin McCormick has a statement to read.
Yes.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me, Senator?
Yes.
Hello? Okay, great. This is from Don Reed. Many of you know Don. He's been a longtime champion of stem cell research and a great friend to CIRM. He's written a number of books about us, and he was also been really instrumental in helping get both Proposition 71 and 14 passed. So Don writes, as a longtime fan of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, I am, of course, delighted with the forward steps CIRM is taking, especially this committee. Long ago, at the Seattle World's Fair, I saw a gigantic computer seeming, to my child's eyes, as big as a city block. I remember being impressed that it could both add and subtract big numbers. It cost millions of dollars and was hailed at the time as a tremendous accomplishment. Today, computers that can do far more are available as children's toys. Similarly, I believe there will soon be cost reductions in regenerative medicine, ways to lower the expenses of stem cell therapy, to save lives and ease suffering. You are the leading edge of that great struggle. We in the public will watch what you do with great interest, and you find ways to lower costs and increase accessibility, either for clinical trials or the therapies themselves. You are doing the world an enormous favor. You are helping to bring cures within the reach of everyone. We wish you health and strength and joy. Thank you very much. Don C. Reed.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other further public comment? All right. There being none, again, I want to thank Emily and Marianne and Maribel and Jeff and Sean and Dr. Milan for all of your help in this effort, and Adriana and JT, obviously, and Maria Gonzalez Bonaville for being part of that Fresno meeting. It was very important. What's exciting for me is that whenever I would write legislation, the most important part was not getting it passed or signed by the governor, is to see how it began to be implemented. And I think now with Bob Klein and myself writing the language for affordability and accessibility in Proposition 14, we are now seeing the potential and pivotal implementation of that language. And I am very excited for patients across the state. So thank you again for all your work, and have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you, Senator.